Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 18, talking about the politics of protest. And we're going to focus, first of all, on the rise of the youth movements. So, a lot of this really goes back to the 1950s, when we talked a little bit about the beat movement of that era of time, kind of started by poets and writers. A lot of them were World War II veterans who were kind of dissatisfied with the world that they lived in, and they criticized American culture of that period of time. But as we move into the 60s, the Beats kind of evolve into this movement of baby boomers. And as a result of that, it kind of really gravitates to college campuses, where many of these baby boomers are starting to show up in the era of the Vietnam War. So, a couple of the different protest groups that you would have found on campuses. We have the New Left, that was part of what we call the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. And they initially started off by trying to criticize kind of American culture of like the late 50s, early 60s. They wanted to stop accepting this whole idea of big corporations trying to run our country and to run our government. And eventually, SDS starts protesting the Vietnam War. This all begins at the University of Michigan, and the man who gets it started was a guy named Tom Hayden, who was the one time husband of Jane Fonda, who was a notorious anti war protester and actress of that era of time. Another movement, kind of more on the West Coast, was the free speech movement. And it really kind of centers around the University of California at Berkeley. Um, the campus itself, the administration had some different rules that kind of restricted individuals' First Amendment rights. And many of these protesters were wanting to distribute literature that were for some of the leftist political causes. That caused a stir among the administration, and students protested the fact that on campus they didn't like classes being taught by grad assistants or grad students. They didn't like the rules that had been made by the administrators. And students revolted, and they abandoned their classes, and many times they were occupying some of the different college buildings. And these proved to be very effective strategies. It's kind of like having a sit down strike in a sense, or a teach in. The Supreme Court, at some point in time, is going to hear a case that's dealing with this event in California. And the court upheld the students' rights to free speech and the right to peacefully assemble on college campuses. And in a way, this kind of changes how this movement's really going to be seen. Today, when you talk about universities, it seems like maybe they have embraced more of a leftist point of view as far as politics and such. But needless to say, this movement really kind of opened up a lot of people's eyes towards having dialogue and free speech. The man that you see kind of at the podium and being arrested and on top of the car is a man named Mario Savio, and he was the leader of the free speech movement in California. Counterculture. When you talk about, anything that is counter, it usually means opposite. And in a way, the counterculture was kind of a movement that was opposite of the mainstream culture of the period of time. A lot of times when we think about counterculture, we tend to think about hippies, people who were kind of free spirited, people who rejected conformity and rationality and tradition and such. And starting in the mid 1960s, you had a lot of young people that had flocked to cities. Many of them had formed organizations or joined organizations that might have had like people sharing living quarters without regard to people um, being married or even gender and such. And one particular neighborhood that became kind of really tightly associated with the hippies was a area of San Francisco known as the Haight-Ashbury. And if you take a look at the picture down below in the left-hand corner, it basically was the name of the intersection of where Haight and Ashbury kind of came together is where this district was. A lot of young people came here looking for like-minded people, embracing, kind of the hippie lifestyle and music and drugs and whatnot. Many hippies who might have been dissatisfied with city living moved towards rural areas and established communes. And a commune is basically an arrangement where people share pretty much all their resources and such. Um, Many of these hippie communes were kind of, maybe spiritual. Some of them might have even had the undertones of being somewhat of a cult because they had a lot of charismatic leaders that were leading them. So, if you start talking about like Charlie Manson, I think it kind of looks like he has a commune, but yet at the same time, he had a way of kind of manipulating and brainwashing people to do all sorts of awful things. So, in a way, the public um, persona of hippies was not necessarily always very positive. A lot of hippies, embraced drug culture. They also popularized long hair and different styles of fashion. Many of them rejected the idea of consumerism and social classes by embracing like recycled clothing or ethnic clothing. What I think is interesting is our hippie movement of the 1960s is going to kind of evolve. When our hippies kind of become part of the working class and uh, earning wages. And what ends up happening is you have the hippies of the late 60s become the yuppies of the 1980s. So, yeah, I mean, the ideals of the 60s sounded great, but they weren't necessarily long lived by a lot of the people who originally embraced these ideas. Anyway, much of this reaction to the 1950s stereotype of the white collar man in the gray flannel suit was really kind of what started all of this in the first place. Um, Even in the counterculture, you had some people that were interested in diet and food production. And this led to kind of a rapid growth of health food stores and also vegetarian and vegan restaurants. Some of that is still with us even to this day. When you talk about other events, there were um, a lot of music that was being performed during the 1960s that obviously was a big motivator to the anti war movement and maybe even to some of the civil rights movement as well. And folk music kind of is where this begins. But as we kind of move into the latter part of the 1960s, um, even folk music kind of crosses lines into rock and roll. And one of the first artists to kind of do that was a guy named Bob Dylan. Dylan was a kid from Minnesota. He had actually moved to New York, kind of got involved in the beat movement, started off as a folk artist, and by the mid 1960s, had embraced the electrified guitar and angered a lot of his original fans when he started playing rock music. Um, and speaking of playing rock music, there were a couple big music festivals in the 1960s. You had Woodstock, that was 3 days of peace, love, and rock and roll in New York, where originally it was going to be kind of a festival event where people would go there, they would see people who were making arts and crafts and listen to music, and people broke down the barriers. And what would have been kind of a ticketed event becomes a free event. Lots of people show up and they kind of overwhelm the community for all the resources. And matter of fact, when it starts raining, this whole area becomes kind of like a natural disaster area. But nevertheless, Woodstock is remembered very fondly. It didn't turn a profit until late in the 1970s when the rights to the videos, the film that was shot during this time period became a movie, and when the music was released for people to buy. On the West Coast, you had the Altamont Music Festival, which wasn't really peace, love, and rock and roll to prevent people from getting into the concert for free and freeloading. Uh, the people who were promoting this event, they hired the Hells Angels to be their security. And when the Rolling Stones were performing, fans kind of surged towards the stage when the music started crushing um, some of the people who were in security, some of the bikers, and they started kind of turning against the fans. And the next thing you know, somebody is killed during the middle of this concert. So it was really kind of like the not necessarily the peace, love, and rock and roll image that maybe Woodstock had had. Other aspects of the counterculture were the fact that at some point in time, some of these ideals are going to be adopted by the mainstream, and the more conventional and conservative lifestyles are going to kind of come out of that. Some urban hippie communities also had dangerous places to live. The hate initially in the mid 1960s was relatively safe, but by the time we get to the latter half of the 60s, it is so infested by drugs and violence that it's not a very safe place to be and won't be for many, many years. Counterculture also forced a lot of people to question the fundamental values of individuals in society. So, thank you very much.